Thanks so much for tuning in and joining me for this week's Oracle Outlook video reading. If this is your first time here, I'd like to say welcome, and if you're a returning viewer and visitor, I'd like to say welcome back. If you're here for the first time, my name is James Himm Mitchell, and I have been an Oracle card reader since 1999 and an Oracle card deck creator since 2020. So for this week's Oracle Outlook video reading, I'm going to be using one of my own personal deck creations, and this comes as a request. If you watched last week's video reading, I had a request from a viewer named Kelly who asked me to work with Lenormand. Well, in the comment thread of last week's video, I had yet another request. So this comes from a viewer named Ismail. Ismail, hello, how you doing? This one is for you. In that comment, he asked me if I would be willing to work with Kipper for this week's video reading, and I'm going to honor that request. The deck, as I said, is my own personal deck creation, and I'm going to be working with the Kipper of Himm. So I'm not sure if I've spoken about how I got into Kipper in previous videos, so I'm going to elaborate. And it's nice because it comes on the heels of me learning how to work with Lenormand. So I have been in the YouTube sphere since 2015. When I started making weekly video readings, I started with tarot because at that point, that was the only tool, the only system of divination I worked with at the time. And then maybe about 2017, 2 years later, I got into Lenormand. Well, as a result of that, another colleague who read Lenormand at the time, her name is Kelly Fitzgerald, and her channel is The Truth in Story. She watched one of my videos and gave me the comment that if I loved working with Lenormand, and I did at that time, I raved about Lenormand at that time, she said, you might want to give Kipper a go because it's very similar in nature, and if you get on with Lenormand, you'll probably get on with Kipper. So I took her at her word, and that is how I got into Kipper. And so, fast forward all these years later, about I'd say 2023, I decided I wanted to make my own Kipper deck because Kipper is divided into categories, and I wanted to highlight each category. So in my deck, the categories are differentiated by colored borders. So, and that's an homage to my very first Kipper deck, which is the Mystical Kipper. If you're familiar with that deck, you'll know that various cards have different colored borders. But in that deck, I think it was more a design aesthetic than anything else. So mine has a little bit more of an intention behind it. So I have the deck on hand. I have it on the table. And so here's the deck. And the back of the cards is an abstract of the German flag. And so another little tidbit to this deck creation is that the reason why it's called the Kipper of Himm is because at that time I was really into looking into my genealogy, and so some of the platforms that I used for that, because I used a number of different platforms, some of them came back with my ethnicity estimate reports saying that it had German ancestry in my makeup. So I thought, well, if that's the case, then I would want to have a Kipper deck named after me in some shape, form, or fashion. Okay, so that's the story behind the name of the Kipper of Himm. So again, deck in hand, I'm going to go ahead and shuffle the cards a little bit as I do each week on camera, just so you can see that the deck is being shuffled before I move to the table that is next to me. And as I begin shuffling, I always set the intention for any information, guidance, instruction even, that's going to be most helpful and beneficial as we move through the course of the week to come through the cards. And I always like to remind those of you who tune in, and thank you, by the way, very much for tuning in, that these are general readings, and so my disclaimer is that not everything that is said or stated in terms of the information that comes through the cards is going to resonate with 100% of the viewers who land on this video. So I always encourage people to take what resonates and just put the rest aside. So I'm continuing to shuffle. I think this will be my last shuffle. Okay. So now I'm going to do what I always do. I like to cut the cards away from me, and this is just something that I do when I'm reading for other people, and in this case, this is a collective reading. And then I fan the cards out, and then I'm just looking at the fan for 5 cards that are getting my attention, because I always like to work with a line of 5 when it comes to systems of divination or fortune telling, like Lenormand and Kipper. So I have the 5 cards selected, putting the remainder of the deck aside. So I have them in a line. And so we're just going to read the line left to right. And the interesting thing about Kipper is that it may start out one way and then the line could shift and change based on the card and the category it belongs to. Okay? So opening the line up, we have, first and foremost, we have the letter card opening things up. So this card, in traditional Kipper cartomancy, it can be known as pleasant letter or pleasant news. It implies communication of all kinds. Even though a letter is depicted on the card, this can be written forms of communication, verbal forms of communication. So communication is the jumping off point of the week ahead. So I usually encourage people to just be mindful of the conversations. If you're having a conversation and it has some intention, some level of intention to it, it's about remembering what it is that you want to say, and also too keep in mind of how you want to deliver it, right? Because we in this day and age deliver letters in the mail, yeah? So delivery might be key. Now, written forms of communication could also be emails and text messages, again with the idea of maybe being very intentional about what you write and how you write it. And here's the interesting thing between the nuance between verbal communication and written communication, which is nonverbal, right? Sometimes it loses, and when I say it loses, I'm talking about the written forms of communication. It may lose its tone and inflection and things like that. And sometimes with written communication, you have to sometimes read between the lines, right? Whereas with verbal, you have to kind of maybe consider what is being said as well as what's not being said, right? So, I said verbal communication, text messages, emails, voicemails, right? So this would be like verbal communication through the phone lines, or, you know, needing to leave voicemails. Those are another form of messaging. And then the other thing I would say about this card is that it can also be about paperwork and documentation, right? So there may be something in writing that requires our attention, and other cards might validate that, because I'm thinking in my mind right now at this moment could be more of official paperwork, official documentation, things like that. But generally speaking, letter is a card of communication of all forms and all types. Now, the border of the card is red, so in my deck that signifies that this is what's known as a stop card, right? So we'll have to see. So like if this was the only card, it would be like full stop, right? Kind of thing. Like this is what the story is, right? Because the way I read Kipper, Kipper's like telling a story. This is what the story is, and so this is it, full stop. Okay? So that is letter. Next card up we have, okay, so here we have, next to that, we have short illness. Now, I'll start with the border on this card. This card has a pink border, and in my deck, this signifies a connector card. So there is a connection being made between this card and the letter, right? So now, the meaning of the card. So when short illness comes up, this card can signify the need to take a break, take a rest, because we have a gentleman in the image. And this is one of the things I love about Kipper, is that whereas Lenormand, you don't read into the image or the symbol on the card, Kipper, you can read a little bit into the imagery. So here we have a person who is in bed, and he's getting his temperature checked, yeah? So this could just represent a need for rest, a recovery period of time, recuperation, that kind of thing. So it could be a need to take a break, maybe consider how much sleep or sleep you're not getting. A personal note, I work 2 jobs, so I'm always telling people that I'm always on the spectrum in terms of fatigue, yeah? Because I don't get as much sleep these days as I used to. So, so it could be a need for rest, a need for sleep, going through a period where you're in recuperation, recovery, healing, that kind of thing. It could also be in terms of like job or work. This could be taking some time off from work, right? It could also be that people may be getting, and this is where I'm going to connect the letter in a moment. People may be getting encouraged to take time off. So now let me bring in letters. This is what I mean. Okay, so now if we connect this card to letter, and I said that letter can be written forms of communication. Yes, right now what I'm seeing here is that if we go with the idea of maybe on the job front, that there may be people who are getting time off from work. Now this could be you're putting in a time off request because one of my jobs, I have a job in retail, and if we want time off, that's called PTO, we have to put in a request for time off, and that is a form of communication or messaging, yeah? So somebody may need to do that with their job or their work. It could also be that people are being kind of forced to take time off. So this could be for some people that there may be news in written form of communication about layoffs or taking time off. It could also be that somebody is going to maybe possibly retire, because for me short illness is a card that could suggest retirement, because in the image we have somebody lying in bed, and for me back in the day there used to be an expression that I'm going to retire for the evening, and that was a nice way of saying I'm going to bed, right? So it could be like somebody is considering retirement, and maybe in preparation of that, right? Stop the message, letter card before that. Could be like I'm preparing to get my paperwork or documentation for that, right? So there's a couple of ways of reading that in terms of job and employment, and in terms of getting time off. It could be, number one, needing to take a break or vacation, something of that nature from job. That would be temporary time off, and you have to put in the paperwork for that. And or people are going there's going to be news circulating about possible layoffs regarding work and employment, or that people are considering retirement, right? So now the other thing I will say is that this card, since it is the only card in the Kipper deck that has a bed in the image, so this could also be about sexual relations, right? Because not only do we just sleep in a bed, but we have sexual relations in bed. And so this card can just be about sexual relations, sexual activity, things like that, right? So that's just an aside, right? And it could be, okay, so now, because I was thinking, how do I connect a letter to that in that context? So there may be conversations, right? Because I said letter was about verbal communication, right? It represents communication in all forms. So there may be conversations or communications regarding a sexual relationship. So there is that with these two cards. So now, we going forward, if short illness is a card that's a connector card, it's already connected to one card on this side, but there's a card on this side as well. So now, let's see what the middle card is. Yeah, okay, and so now here we have the family room card. Okay, so short illness is now connected to this card as well, right? And here's the interesting thing. I'm going to go with the last thing I said. So now if this card can be about sexual activity and sexual relations, the interesting thing about the family room card, this is a card that talks about privacy, yeah? So here we have the possibility of communication or conversation regarding sex and sexual relations and keeping that private, yeah? So that's an interesting thing, right? Now, if we focus on this as the focus card of the line, because the way I read the line is that the third card in the line for me always represents the central issue or the focus or the heart of the matter. family room can mean a couple of things. Number one, it could signify in the literal sense, this is a room within a larger space. So this would be a room in a home, or it would be a room in an office or a larger building, something of that nature. It could be an apartment in an apartment building, just to kind of give you some ideas in terms of this card. And it's, you know, just going beyond the idea that it could represent a living room in a home, right? So there's that. But the gist of the card, outside of the idea that it can actually represent a physical room or space, it really talks about the idea of privacy. So it could just be a matter at the central issue or focus of this week is about our sense of privacy, keeping things private, keeping things between ourselves and maybe a few select people, right? So that is what I want to say about family room. The last thing I will say about the cards, with this dynamic, with the first three cards, we have a stop card, then a connector card, and then a stop card. So when I see a number of stop cards in a line, it can suggest that there's not a lot of progress, not a lot of movement in the course of the week. Yeah, because these stop cards tend to slow the story down or bring the story to a stop or conclusion, right? So it could just be that there's going to be a conversation maybe around the idea of bringing some aspect of a personal relationship or a private relationship to a close, yeah? So that is a possibility, right? But I'm also going to say that this may be a week where people are talking about, and it could be in a personal sense, people are talking about, you know, what is privacy, you know, in terms of relationships, or keeping certain aspects of relationships private, right? Or there's going to be a larger conversation around this idea about privacy and maybe tied to what people do behind closed doors. Okay. Next up, continuing the line, here we have an interesting pattern developing. So here we have the next card, fourth card in, is get together. So now this is known as a card that can represent hanging out, right? So this is about hanging out with, being social. It's known as meetings. So this could be about meetings, appointments on the schedule, casual get-togethers, things like that. Now, the interesting dichotomy here is that here on this side we have short illness, and remember I said this card is about sex and sexual activity, right? But also about healing and recovery, right? This card here is also about getting together but keeping things casual, right? So it could just be if I mirror the cards, right? And mirroring is where you take cards on opposite sides of the spectrum and kind of combine them. So here we have this idea about maybe, you know, casual sex, casual sexual activity, right? That kind of thing. It reminds me of the idea like friends with benefits. This is an interesting reading because I usually don't talk about this topic this often or in this way. So there's that. Okay. Now the interesting thing to note is that we have another connector card. So here we have family room connected to get together, right? So it could just be intimate get-togethers, close and personal gatherings, right? Maybe not in larger public social venues, but maybe meeting people, you know, in homes, things like that, right? This card, get-togethers, could imply something of a more social nature. Like, so I think I have in the image, I have two people who are meeting in a public venue, right? So it might not necessarily be that, you know, you're meeting in large public venues or large crowds of people. It may be something that is more intimate. And then that could also be another way of combining or bringing in short illness, something that's more intimate. Yeah? But this card is also be, and it could also be too, as we move closer to the Christmas holiday season, there may be an emphasis on more get-togethers, but it could be that we choose to be in more intimate, personal gathering spaces for that. So now this is a connector card, like I said, so now it's going to connect to the last card. So here we have last card. Okay, So at the end of the line, we have a movement card. The green border is for movement cards in my deck. And so here we have, after, a couple of stop cards showing up at the end of the week, there may be some movement. And so this card for me is about progress being made. I love seeing it at the end of the line because it suggests that there may be some progress being made or something that is down the road, right? So this could be something where it's a long time coming, or if we're noting our progress through life, then it's about, seeing how far we've come. But here at the end of the line, it's maybe more future oriented, right? Because this is, remember, a reading for the week ahead. So by the week's end, we may be seeing some progress being made, or it's about envisioning what could happen down the line, down the road, right? So if we go with the opening card, letter, there may be some conversations being had around our personal relationships with others, right? And personal doesn't necessarily mean like short illness is talking about sex and sexual activity. It could be just be how we are forming more intimate bonds with people, right? And intimacy just represents this idea about getting closer to people and not necessarily around physicality, yeah? So it could just be a matter of where we are looking at maybe certain relationships and wondering where they're going down the line, especially now. Remember, connecting cards. Maybe there's a more casual relationship, or casual relationships generally speaking, and how can we maybe create more longevity in those relationships. Basically saying this, people are going to be questioning, where do we go from here? Where is this relationship going? That kind of thing, right? And so for some people, it could be, I'm going to offer a couple of scenarios. It could be that maybe people rushed into a sexual situation and now they're wanting to make it more of a friendship type scenario. And they want to maybe have a conversation about that and seeing where that relationship is going down the road. It could also be that a particular scenario is about, forming a more deep, intimate connection beyond the physical and seeing where that's going as well. So again, my disclaimer is that each scenario is not going to resonate or fit 100% of the viewers who land on this. So you have to kind of choose whichever scenario works best for you and kind of go forward with that. But that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing communication, conversations around our relationships and where they are going, and whether we want to make them more friendship-based or more intimacy-based, right? And just seeing what is going on with those relationships as they currently are and where we would like to see them going. Also, too, I don't want to leave out the idea that there may be people who are transitioning from work, whether it is self-imposed, meaning I'm kind of the initiator or taking the initiative in that, or it's somehow being imposed upon you, and then you are having to decide what you want to do with that. I will say, if that resonates with you, that scenario resonates with you, then it's a matter of get-togethers telling me to kind of like consider who's your network. This would be about getting your network together, or having a network in place in terms of the next job or business opportunity. So that is the Oracle Outlook reading for this week. If you hung out with me this far in the video and made it all the way through, thank you so much for giving me the gift of your time. I know in this day and age, you can choose to do a number of things with your time, so I'm always so thankful and grateful when you give me the gift of that time, and I don't take that lightly. So again, James Himm Mitchell signing off for this week's video reading. I will be holding space for you and looking forward to seeing you here again for our next Oracle Outlook video reading. So until then, take care, be well, and have a great week.